Hi, Adam. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Lori. Thank you for being a moderator. Thank you to Karen Hall for introducing us. Thank you to Jennifer Widman for helping organize all of this. I know how hard it is to put on a festival under normal circumstances, but I'm sure this one was especially challenging. I had hoped to set foot on South Dakota soil in person so I could see my grandmother, but it will have to happen remotely. But I'm sure we'll have a great conversation.
How has this pandemic been for you as a writer, figuring out not only how to navigate it, but then, rethinking everything? I mean, everybody's rethinking what's essential in their life. You travel so much and you like to travel with your family, I read. So, what has this time been like for you in San Francisco?
Well, as a writer, of course, there are many ways in which lives are affected. But as a writer, I just happened to be in like the seventh year of a long project. And so I was really hunkered down in a narrative and I knew what I was going to work on every single day. And, actually I had a lot of travel this year that I all had to cancel. And it just reduced everything to, my students, my family, and my work. And actually there was lots of quality time. I know many people are suffering in so many ways. But in terms of like my work, nothing changed. I just kept plugging away every day.
Yeah.
And I write about displacements, about challenges, about difficult times and struggle. And so this dovetailed nicely thematically with what I'm doing.
Let's talk about narrative, because in this book, The Orphan Master Son, there's so, from a craft perspective, it's very intricately woven, especially in part two, where we see different timelines and different points of view and shifting identities and things like that. For first, I think for people who maybe haven't read the book and are curious about it and have come because it's you or because they're interested in reading it, we should give a little bit of background. So I think I'll let you do that. Pulitzer Prize winning Orphan Master Son, which happens to get released after Kim Jong-il dies. Was that just a coincidence that this book kind of came on the market right when this huge transition was happening in the DPRK?
Well, I don't think Kim Jong-il was a believer,
No.
but it affirmed my faith. A writer I admire, Thomas Keneally, wrote a book about Saddam Hussein, had a ghostwriter. And in the middle of the book, Saddam Hussein died. And then when he published it a couple years later, people weren't terribly interested in it. So one of my great fears was that one of my central characters would die in real life. But, but that actually happened just as my book was coming out. But also I think that, that funeral that many people saw on TV of the cold January funeral of Kim Jong-il across Pyongyang. And we saw millions of people weeping at the funeral. And I think most of us wondered, like, were those people really sad for this dictator who oppressed them? Or did they have to fake it to live? And I think people were curious about this place and what the reality and the humanity of this place was. And luckily, at least for people who turn to novels, I had a portrait there that could speak to that.
We know so little. And this, one of the things I think a lot of people know about North Korea, other than the Kim family, is this notion of darkness. This satellite imagery of the world lit up, and then you see this dark space, which is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And darkness is very much a theme in this book, not only in character development, but thematically throughout the story. So, talk about selecting that notion of the thing that we all do know about North Korea, probably most likely, and trying to figure out what does it mean for this main character, for our protagonist, and just playing with that as an author, like how many different ways can I make this darkness a character itself?
Sure. Well, it's a relatively impoverished country. Um, you know, uh, North Korea has very little ability to generate electricity. So the darkness is just a matter of fact. When you go there, You can see how at night all the lights go out, and until dawn, and natural light comes. So that's just kind of something they have to work around. When I came back from North Korea, like when I was there, when you would walk into a public room, there would be a sensor and the lights would turn on. And when you would leave the room, the lights would turn off. And, I saw one escalator there and it had a little motion detector. And when you walked up to it, it would turn on and take you up. And when you stepped off, it would turn off. And when I came back to America and saw, like at the mall, the escalators running forever with no one on them, and all of our glowing lights on all night long, I really thought about the waste of that, and why are we illuminating, the night sky in that way? But, everyone there must, that also means the elevators turn off at night, and, nothing can function. There's no lamps on at the street, and everybody moves around in shuttles at great speed once the lights go out. I remember our driver was hesitant to turn on his headlights, and we kept arguing with him to please turn on his headlights. And he said to us that, when his headlamps burned out, he was never going to get another pair. And so he would drive around in absolute darkness with no streetlights on, and he would just snap them on every once in a while to just make sure he was doing okay. And we just pleaded with him for safety's sake to turn on the lights, and he eventually conceded to that. So it's a sign of privation and of how people have to adapt, but it also allows people to evade the gaze of their government and take secret strolls at night and have quiet conversations and to maybe be themselves in some way.
And that seems to be the thing that fascinates you the most about these characters' lives. Not only that they live under this narrative, which is created for them by the one and only storyteller, which is the dear leader, but that in these secret moments, in a bedroom, in a prison camp, out in a park at night, that they would have these conversations. Talk about imagining yourself into that space of people's lives, but people who have known nothing other than this one story that they are characters in and have to play a role in.
That's right. Well, all we know about North Korea comes from satellite photos, and the people who leave. And they're a small group. It's a self-selecting group. It's people who've, often had the most trauma and the most difficult lives. And, we kind of hail the people who leave as champions and freedom fighters, but what we don't think about is when someone defects, the people who pay the price are the people who are left behind. And so to leave means to hurt those you love, or it means you're able to leave because you have no one. And so these are the portraits we get of North Korea are often the darkest portraits, people who suffered the worst under the famine or under oppression. Imagine, like, even if someone said, oh, you could go to Paris right now if you wanted, you could go get a complete other life, whatever life you wanted, but you would never be able to contact or to know the fates of everyone you've known your whole life. How many people would take that deal? I think North Koreans only leave in the most life and death circumstances, obviously. And so while I was writing the book at first, I didn't understand that the stories I was reading were skewed toward darkness. And like a lot of the stories of people who figured out how to navigate the system and be successful and maybe preserve some of their humanity, they weren't leaving. But a lot of that was about meeting defectors. Your first question is like, why did I structure, the book that way? I will say that when you talk to defectors, one of the shocking things is how much they're like you and how much you have in common with them. Though I've never been in a prison camp or, faced a famine or been tortured, the defectors who get out, what they want is what I want: safety, security, opportunity, better lives for their children, and so they are like us, but they've just lived under extraordinary circumstances and they've seen things we haven't. And, the stories they told often weren't nice beginning, middle, end stories like we tell. And, the meaning making shape of narrative works if the fabric of your life hasn't been torn. And, the defectors from North Korea, their stories, they couldn't find their beginnings. Their stories often fractured. And one of the ways to keep the pain of your story from coming back through the power of narrative. When you tell a painful story, you feel the pain again, is to break it into pieces, to change the point of view and perspective. And by listening to the stories of these people, I knew it would be a mistake to write it in a nice American beginning, middle, end way. Their lives were fragmented, their stories were. And though it made the book a little less accessible, I knew that to be true, I would have to write it the way they would tell it.
And in the sense of even to the pronoun, to the not, we have an interrogator in this book who doesn't want to use the word I. Right. Everything is we, and sort of struggling with this transition to when is it okay to say I, right, and when is it this communal we. I thought this, masterful about that. Tell me about learning that you won the Pulitzer Prize. How did you find out?
Well, I do want to say, just on that point of view thing, there's a sociologist who studied Rwanda named Jean Hatzfeld, and he went and interviewed Hutus who had slaughtered Tutsis, and extensively. His books are really incredible, and he takes oral histories. And one thing he noticed is that the Hutus would speak in the first person. I went down to the river, I did this, I did that. And then when bad things happened, they would switch to the plural, and they'd say, and then we killed them, to diffuse the responsibility for painful things. Yeah. And so, and to hide within the corporate voice of many people. And so that felt really true to me.
Yeah. Before we go and talk about the Pulitzer, I want to pick up on a question in the chat and sort of go back a little bit, because we really haven't talked about the plot of this book. It begins with this character, Pak Jun-do, who is an orphan. This is the Orphan Master Son of the title. He's convinced that his father is actually the Orphan Master, and his mother is this beautiful portrait that the Orphan Master has. So it is told, Phyllis, to answer your question, and I'll let Adam talk about the why of that, and the implications of that from an ethical perspective, as you're wondering. But the entire thing is told from the perspective of Pak Jun-do, later on an interrogator who is also North Korean. And Adam, the question is, when these people are not able to tell their own stories in a way, at least that is coming to us, right, that we know of, nothing that we see except from the defectors, how do you wrestle with the implications of being the person to imagine yourself into their lives and speak for them in a way?
That's a great question. I was writing another book, and I read a memoir of a defector called The Aquariums of Pyongyang, and I just had no idea that a life could be lived like this on the planet Earth. And it was about a man named Kang Chol-hwan, and he went into a gulag named Camp 15 in North Korea at the age of 9, because there are family camps. So if someone in your family commits an offense against the state, or is believed to, the whole family goes into the gulag. And he was there for 10 years, from 9 to 19. And he had the triple crown of survival. He got out of a North Korean gulag, he got out of North Korea, and then he got out of China, which these days is sometimes the hardest, to tell his story. And I just became obsessed about North Korea. I was like, what is this place? I wondered, if I was a writer, what would I have to write? If I was a dad, how would I find my wife? What did I eat for breakfast? What did I see out my window? And I began reading books obsessively, but most of the books were about geopolitics and military and economic things. But the human things, how do people date? What's school like? Can you play the music you want to play? I realized that stuff wasn't in books. And so I discovered narratives online that were being gathered by aid workers and Christian missionaries. And like at night after I finished all the work I had to do, I would stay up late just reading these stories. And they were so hard to find at that time in like 2004. They were so powerful. I was like, why are they so hidden? And then these stories kind of filled me up. And like when someone gives you a painful story, it's like handing you a stone. And you either have to carry it around or find something meaningful to do with it. And what I do is I write. And I started to wonder, like, these people aren't allowed to tell their stories. And the defectors often can't because they're so traumatized. And then I was like, who am I to write the story? I'm like a white dude from California. Like I don't even speak Korean, you know? But I felt a duty, and there was a silence, an emptiness. And so I started writing, and every day I had to face that question, who am I and what am I doing? But over time, the more I studied North Korea, like for years, another question came that was kind of unanswerable, and it sat beside it. And it was like, why aren't more people trying to tell the stories of the most silenced people on the planet Earth? You know, it was a big challenge. In the end, I don't have the answers to either of those questions, you know.
What do you hope you're wrong about?
Well, I mean,
When we get to the point, and I guess I'm an optimist, but this is sort of a very American optimism, because when I was in the Marine Corps, as an intel person who covered, Korea, I think it was right after the Berlin Wall had fallen,
right,
which dates me to that period. And I think there was a sense that at any given moment, these people in North Korea were going to do the same thing. They were going to go, they wanted to reunite. They wanted to be with their families. They wanted blue jeans from the West. They wanted all these things that we sort of had this idea as young people, that the East Germans just sort of claimed for themselves. And that didn't happen. But if that happened in some context, and we end up getting more of these people telling their own stories, when you go back into the book that you imagined, into the world that you imagined, what do you hope that you got wrong?
well, I hope the transition is slow. I hope the transition comes soon. Um, in East Germany, I mean, if you're in Dresden, you got West German broadcasts. And so you knew what that other life was like. I wonder the degree to which North Koreans have any idea what life is like. There's more information now. There is South Korean soap operas and things like that. But if I could just, we're at a book festival and I have an audience of book lovers. If you think, and I know you know this Korean history, if you think about it, the Japanese begin their empire heading toward World War II by invading Korea in 1910. And that begins the colonial period. And the Japanese take all the Korean food. They take Korean slave labor to mainland Japan. As Japan built its war machine, they didn't have Rosie the Riveters in their culture. They had Korean slave labor in Mitsubishi factories, And so starting in 1910, the Japanese made Korean literature illegal, Korean music illegal, the Korean language illegal, Korean names illegal. They imported Japanese teachers to teach the kids Japanese history. And so for 30 years, all art is kind of erased in Korea. And then there's World War II. And, America and Russia race across the world to extinguish the Japanese empire. And the place they meet is in tiny little Korea, which they split in two. And they install the North. And so then there's a civil war, which is devastating. And then, since 51, there's like a totalitarian regime for over 7 decades. And so if you're from North Korea, you haven't been able to have literature, your own Korean literature in your life for over a century. The oldest North Korean can't remember a North Korean who ever read a book like we would read, that would question society, that would question humanity, and that would question authority. And so, like, there's one North Korean who we know secretly wrote poetry there. I interviewed him, a man named Jan Jin Sung. His book is called Dear Leader. I hope there are more. I hope, in the worst days of Russia, there was underground literature. Solzhenitsyn wrote in the gulags. I hope there are people keeping art and expression alive, though there's almost no evidence of it. Sorry, that didn't end optimistically, did it?
I like the idea, though, that if we could be wrong about something, that there is some kind of vibrant underground storytelling or keeping of the stories of people's lives. I think that's hopeful. That's hopeful in some ways. The people in this book and are part of this story, the story that is, because they are having to manufacture spontaneously to save their own lives, things that happen to them. You make a tiny mistake. So we have Jundo on a fishing vessel, and the American Navy, there's an encounter, the American Navy boards the ship, and now when they go back to their, to report back to shore, they have to come up with a story that somehow creates, and there's an absurdity to this story, and it's almost like children sort of planning, okay, what will mom believe? But there was this like, how did we do this? How did we defeat the Americans and save pride for the great leader? And so talk a little bit, if you would, just about this whole idea of these people relentlessly to save their lives having to figure out how to navigate what is the story of myself and my own behavior, and they go to great extremes to prove these fabrications to save their lives. Explore that with us a little bit. Tell us more deeply what that's like and how you chose to write about it.
Well, I might say two things. One, when I was in Pyongyang, it's a world capital. It's a big city. The streets are very wide. There are very few cars, almost no bicycles. So people walk in huge throngs, like giant schools of fish. They walk fast and with determination because their lives are busy. And it's illegal for a non-citizen to engage a citizen of North Korea. So the one place in the world I cannot talk to a North Korean is in North Korea. And I had this feeling when I was there that if I could just meet one person for tea and ask her all these questions, like I wouldn't have had to write the book to imagine it all. But it's a crime and they would be in trouble if I even tried. And our guide told us she had a PhD in handling foreigners with a specialization in Americans. And I had a feeling we had a genuine encounter, but that was her job, to give me that feeling. And so it was so surreal to not be able to talk to a human or to know the humans I was allowed to talk to. In fact, in the hotel that I stayed in, the Rugyong, to keep me away from North Koreans, all the hotel workers were Chinese workers on contract. So I wouldn't even meet a wait person who was North Korean. And the second thing I'll say is that Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, before he took over, when his father died of a heart attack, he was head of the Central Cinema Agency, and he loved movies. And he famously had 15,000 DVDs, and he would watch movies every night with his entourage. And he had a problem with his movies, and we have him on record saying it. He was secretly recorded once in which he said, there are no artists in North Korea, he says. Everyone just does whatever they think I want them to do to survive. And they will do nothing creatively because that would be dangerous. And so what he did was he sent kidnapping teams to kidnap South Korea's most famous director, a man named Shin Sang-gok, who'd made 60 films. He was the Francis Ford Coppola of South Korea. And he sent a team to kidnap their most famous actress, a starlet named Chae Eun-hee, who was a friend of Marilyn Monroe, actually. And so that's how he solved things. He just stole people and he forced them under threat of prison to make movies for him. They made a daring, unbelievable escape, which is worth a whole hour to talk about. But when Chae Cheon-hee got back from North Korea after spending a decade there, one of the things she said that struck me is she said, when I was an actress in South Korea, I acted when they turned the camera on. She said, but in North Korea, you must act every moment of every day of your life, which means what is the nature of reality? And you don't have to be a North Korean to ask that question. I think we should all ask, who are we? What is our reality? Are we making our own decisions? Do we have our own moral compasses? And so that was rich territory for a writer.
Yeah. We talked about how, there are comic moments in this, and certainly much of the humor comes from the absurdity of the situations and just from people's humanity. It's hard not to make a comparison to just the absurdity of 2020, where how many times we have turned around and said, yeah, of course that happened. It's 2020, and this is, and also this whole focus on propaganda and what you see that is real and what you see that is not real in an age when, and I am not making a comparison between the United States and North Korea, because I don't think that there is a close correlation, but we are living in this time when reality is crafted for us in certain ways. Most of us can catch it and identify it and call it out, or even ban it or shout against it. But are there lessons from a people who live under great absurd conditions for us here on the other side of the world?
Well, if I could take the first part of it first, which was a question of humor, there's humor in my life, and, I'm drawn to humor. So that is in my work, regardless of the subject matter. And, I had someone say to me, North Korea can't be funny. Those people are suffering. You can't make jokes in that. And I would just say two things. One is, if I was to take humor out of the book, it would reduce the full spectrum of what it is to be human, and it would deny some of their humanity in some way. And I haven't met that many defectors. There's people who've met way more than myself. But I will say, if I can generalize, the defectors I've talked to at length are the funniest human beings I have ever met. And and it is a dark humor, right?
Right.
A gallows humor, but also like a Russian humor. Like, they get absurdities and ridiculousness, and that territory is familiar to them. And even through, because I don't speak Korean, even through our translators, I would ask a question, I would see someone laugh, then the translator would crack up laughing, and then she would tell me what he said, and I would crack up laughing. And so, I mean, we need humor to survive strange times. And that's one of the things I'm worried is being, taken from 2020. And the second thing is, is there propaganda in our world? When I started writing the book in 2004, and I finished 7 years later in 2011, the Bush administration was just running, the second term was just about to begin. And, whatever you think of, that political spectrum, like, I had thought that in politics, people spun things. But one of the attributes in North Korea is that they name things the opposite. And so, like, in, Camp 15, the whole family's going, there's a section for old people. And if you're of a certain age, you get separated from your families, and you work in the Respect for Elders furniture factory until you die. And so, really, in studying North Korea, it made me believe that actually propaganda is alive and well in America. And, I remember under the Bush administration, they did the Healthy Forests Act, which allowed people to cut down more trees. And I was like, whoa, Kim Jong-il would have loved that. And they also did the Clean Skies Act, which allowed power plants to pollute more. And I thought that's straight out of the North Korean playbook. So that stuff is here, and it's not just spin.
Yeah. There is, and I think that adds some of the comedy, I thought, to, when there is the best North Korean story of the year. And so let's talk about this reality a little bit. And for people who haven't read the book, this character Jundo sort of shifts identities. There is a mistaken identity, which turns into a put upon identity. And so there's all these themes of identity and who you are, and naming that are woven in here. And in the meantime, there's this other narrative that's kind of coming from the official channels, which is a third point of view to say, this is what the people are hearing happened. And then we see, a different point of view of the same scene, for example. Is that fair, Adam? Am I getting the description?
Yeah, there's like three narrative threads about the same character. And we see kind of in an objective portrait, the life he lives. Mm-hmm. And then he's captured by the state because he transgresses, and a man tortures him until he gets his story. And that story is a retelling of that first life. And then the government takes that story that's been tortured out and twists it into a happy North Korean story that affirms the government. So you see one life through the prism of three uses and realities there, which was actually, I don't think I could have approached the complexity of that place without those different lenses, those different truths, because, it gave me a happy ending. He was a martyr for the government, right? It gave me a true ending, and it gave me a sad ending.
Yeah. It's a love story on all levels. There's love of finding father figures, of people connecting with other people that they love in a familial sense. There's a romantic love, and asking what that means and how that happens, and people questioning, how is it possible that happened? Looking for evidence of love. This is what I see this, and therefore I think that's what. I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but at some point there's a water cup, and the idea is that these two people shared a water cup, and at night at the bathroom sink, and therefore they loved each other, because people wouldn't have done that normally. And this is human. This is taking people that sometimes I think we make caricatures out of, the North Koreans, especially if we're just thinking about them as an enemy or a nuclear power, and seeing them as human beings. So tell me about finding those human spaces in a regime where humanity has been stripped. It's like one big concentration camp. There is no humanity left, and yet there is love and romance and a pet dog, of all things, in North Korea. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think human beings are universal. We all want the same things. And that's my definition of truth, is it's valid for all people across all times. That's why we can read a play from 2,000 years ago and it speaks to us, or we can look at a mosaic from Rome and it resonates with us. And I do believe that the North Koreans are just as smart and funny and witty and human as we are. They just happen to be born in the cruelest psychological experiment ever cooked up on Earth. I don't know that it's the most dangerous place in the world. Like, there's the Congo and Syria, but psychologically, it's like living inside of a Skinner box. And what does that mean to not even have your own humanity or identity or reality? And one of the things that I came across in talking to people was that, we had to choose between living a meaningful life and surviving. And when we say, we want to live a meaningful life, that means, like, we talk to kids when they're young and we say, what do you want to be when they grow up? And we encourage them to, self-determine and to take steps and actions to go down a path to lead them toward their most meaningful selves and to fulfill their dreams and to figure out their dreams. And, in North Korea, you're given a role and you're given a job, and your survival depends on how well you perform that. And what you want is actually detrimental to your life. Mm-hmm. And there you have to choose between we would call living a self-determined life, right? and surviving, doing what you have to do. And I think people can't really do both. And that is deeply heartbreaking to me, that notion that you would have a humanity, but have no models for it. And the first person I talked to, actually fairly early on in the book, who was from North Korea, who was born there, was a man named Man Kyun Ha. And he had been an orphan in North Korea. And he told me what it was like to grow up with no one to look out for him, with no one to protect him, to no one to model anything for him, to be vulnerable to exploitation at every turn. And he got to America through Christian, missionaries. And like the dear leader pretends to be this paternal, eternal, loving father. And yet I believe it's like everyone there is an orphan in some essential way. And the orphan master to me was the great script writer and leader, the person responsible for a nation who'd abdicated it all for himself.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what your question made me think of.
Yeah. Speaking of questions, we have about 10 minutes before we have to vacate this room. So you can put your questions on Facebook Live. I'm watching that down here. And up here, we're watching the chat function. So we did have one comment and question. And I guess I would just ask, if you don't have a question, tell me if you read this book, something about this book that will always stick with you. Because here's one thing that stayed with me. This is from Nancy, from the book, is the very arbitrary nature of the main character. Things happen to him, he had no say, no choice, nothing that he could have any say in. Try to imagine that for myself. I can't imagine what that might be like. And that gets back to something, Adam, I think you were saying before about, the responsibility of imagining something as a writer and bringing that imagination to life on the page, especially from people who will not get that opportunity.
Well, I have a character. The first half of the book, it's split in two parts. The first one is very linear, and it's about a character who is a dutiful citizen of North Korea. He does what he's told, when he's told. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't cry when he has to do horrible things. But in the course of his work, he comes to listen to like foreign broadcasts, and he encounters Americans in this crazy scene where on the ocean he meets US Navy sailors, and they're so spontaneous and improvisational and colorful. And he hears the stories of like how other people live their lives, and he starts to wonder about like what life could I live for the first time. And though then he's disposed of, he's thrown into a gulag in the middle of the book. And so, when he makes it out, he decides to live a life of self-determination. And so, for the first half of the book, the character's more of a North Korean character. In the second half, it's one that we would more recognize. Someone who's trying to grow, change, discover, take risks, act, and decide what's most important in life and what he has to do to get that. And that involves love. And so I know that some people, if you only read the first half, there's something flat about it, which felt true. But then I think the book opens prosaically into possibility later. And it turns out you can do whatever you want in North Korea. All you have to do is sacrifice your life.
One of my favorite lines in this whole book, one of the favorite scenes, is immediately before they are boarded by that American vessel, they find floating in the ocean American Western shoes, tennis shoes, Nikes, and they're pulling them in with their fishing nets, and they find these enormous, I think it's a size 15 even or something shoe, and they laugh and wonder what kind of people would wear these shoes. And then when the American sailors come on board, the line is something like, "Here were the men who wore size 15 shoes." And I was, I did that thing that you do as a reader, and you just throw the book down because you can see it from his perspective and what that moment is like to him. Because it's not just about the size of their feet, it's about who they are as the American Navy. Like they represent something that he has not even really imagined before.
Well, there is
All
a
right.
section in which the characters go to America for a chapter.
Right. To Texas, of all places. Of course they go to Texas.
Through North Korean eyes, and everything we love, old cars and cowboy gears and shooting guns and barbecue, they see as the most insane thing in the world. And that defamiliarization about how foreign we might be
Right.
through someone else's eyes, it gave me permission that the book might work.
Yeah. Couple comments from the room. I read The Orphan Master Son right after Adam won the Pulitzer. Even though it was a novel, I felt like for the first time in my life, and I'll be 70 in 2 weeks, I was given an educated glimpse into the life of North Korean people. The writing was splendid and real. I also read his collection of short stories. I would have to go back to tell him which one I like the best, but I'm a big fan. And there's the short story. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it is called Fortune Smiles. So 2 books that I think there's in the chat room. You can click to purchase those books. And Adam,
Diana, let's hang out. Diana, you're my favorite kind of reader.
And I totally agree with Diana. After having spent time in Korea and studied North Korea through the American military, like this is the first time that I was like, oh, I mean, it resonated, even though I did know it was fiction, it resonated. And it was also the first time, Adam, thank you very much, that I was scared. Because, when you're in the military, I think you feel invincible anyway. And of course, I was young. And now looking back at all the situations we were in, I was like, oh, that was not safe at all.
Yeah, were you in Hungary? It's got a moment's notice,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you had an awareness, but I know now, and in years later, I look back and reading this, I thought you were very fortunate to have the protection that you had at the time. All right, there's a link for buying the books. And there was another comment I'm going to scroll back to, and that is, I've not from artists. I've not participated from artists. I have not participated in the Festival of Books before. Welcome. Didn't know what it was about, but I have not read the book. Looking forward to reading it. I just cannot even recommend it enough. It is gripping. It is just brilliantly crafted. You can tell why it won the Pulitzer. Well deserved.
Well,
and one more.
Right too. I mean, I felt it was a deeply rewarding experience to spend time in that realm and to research it.
All right. If there's one more question from the group, we have time for that. If not, I'm going to ask Adam to tell us, finding out about winning the Pulitzer, what that moment was like for you as a writer. How did you get a phone call?
Actually, I was editing a piece for a GQ magazine with an editor in New York, and we were both on Google Docs on different coasts. And, my phone we were on our laptops, my phone kept buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. And my wife was sick at the time. She had cancer at the time, and I was really worried about her. And I said to the editor I was talking to, I said, I think I would need to check this call, he said, okay. And I picked up my phone and it said, congratulations on winning the Pulitzer. And he said, what did the text say? And I said, it said, congratulations on winning the Pulitzer. And he said, it's so funny. He was like, well, I guess congratulations. And I barked at him. I said, don't say shit like that. Somehow it was repellent to me. And he very cautiously said, can I Google it? And I was like silent for a long time. And I said, okay. And he came back and he confirmed it. But, we had a deadline, so we just edited for a couple hours. It was a busy day. And I remember it was a San Francisco day, and my wife and I that evening kind of sat in our bay window with the fog whipping by. And we took stock. And I said, this could probably change our life a great deal. And she said, I don't want it to. She said, we have great kids, and I'm healthy, and you're healthy. And she said, let's pretend it didn't happen. And so we tried to do that all these years. I get reminded all the time by other people, which is okay. But we're fortunate, and we didn't want anything to change.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for telling us that story. Adam Johnson has been our guest. The Orphan Master Son is the novel, Pulitzer Prize winning novel. Fortune Smiles, short stories. There's some links where you can purchase these books and other book festival authors' titles as well. We're going to turn it over to Karen here for any closing housekeeping. But Adam, it's just been a privilege. So thank you for spending
I
time with
thank
us.
you. What a wonderful discussion. You're so smart and knowledgeable. It's been a real treat to share this time with you.
Thank you.